Actually, transition more or less means just movement from somewhere to somewhere on the scale of global economy. And that's more or less how we interpret it now. And that's largely the reason why we wanted this year in this report, to look at a couple, 2-3 things that may be only loosely related. One are the big transitions that are happening in the post-COVID world. And in particular, in the global scheme of things, the move towards much more geopolitical fragmentation, much more kind of not so open economy. So Peter talked about the importance of openness. I think that remains. The best times in economic history were the times of economies opening rapidly to one another. But it's not to say that it has always been like that. If one looks at the history, the end of 19th century, the start of the 20th century was time of very rapid economic integration and very rapid growth. And then First World War, Second World War was a time of great disintegration and scramble for resources. Resources were different. It was mostly about securing access to oil, which was the dominant commodity, other things like coal, gas, etc. And then came time probably between 1980s and 2000s of great economic integration again, very rapid world growth, China integrating into the global system, Soviet Union integrating into the global system, other economies. And the last few years, we're seeing the opposite again, happening quickly. And I will also show some charts that's been particularly quick in literally the last couple of years, hence the report. In addition, every few years, we go around 40 countries and we ask 1,500 people what they think about life satisfaction, various economic policies, their housing, health, etc. And then we compare with what they said before. And we did this survey in 2023. And before that, we did it in 2016. And so in this report, more or less, we put this together. I will give a very short overview, and then we can have time for questions. So in terms of what actually preoccupies policymakers globally now, is the fact that the rapid transitions that we see towards cleaner energy and towards digital infrastructure, people Googling all the time, having artificial intelligence queries and all that, is very intensive in new commodities that were not so important before. So if you look at a traditional coal plant, gas, nuclear, etc., they obviously consume a lot of coal or gas or oil, but otherwise building them requires a little bit of something else, to a large extent, things like copper for electricity transmission. And then if you look at new technologies, solar, wind, or you compare the electric car with the conventional car, it's a ratio of almost 10 of the resources that you need now in terms of various metals. Some of them are well kind of covered, lithium for batteries, etc. Some of that are needed in smaller quantities, like rare earth, graphite, etc., but nonetheless create important bottlenecks. And if we look at what has been happening with their distribution in the world, you would also see that some of them are fairly globally distributed, but in other cases, either mining or refining, just taking the rock and making the material of it, or both, are very strongly concentrated in China, sometimes to the tune of 60 to 90%. And that is generally not true about oil, gas, coal, and traditional commodities that are much more uniformly distributed across the world. So we did this hypothetical exercise where we split the world into two parts based on how countries vote at the United Nations General Assembly. Probably not surprisingly, US will be in one corner and China will be in another corner, and they rarely agree with each other. And then there is a whole spectrum of countries, and when looking at this data, you actually learn something, probably that you wouldn't necessarily expect. The country that is there right in the middle happens to be Armenia, So basically one block is Armenia towards US, the other block is Armenia towards China. And again, you would see that certain things like rare earth and magnesium and a few other elements, platinum, etc., are very strongly concentrated in what is called block other here, which can also be called block China for all useful purposes. And then some things are more uniformly distributed. There are very few things that are strongly concentrated in block West, but they also happen, boron, for example. And then what you see in the data is a very strong push towards much more restrictive policy when it comes to global economy. And the way we measure it in this report is we look at the share of global trade that is subject to some kind of export restrictions. And for a long time, it has been growing a bit. As I said, there was a time between 1980s and 2000s where a lot of them were taken out. Then it has been growing, but it was at the level of 5% or so. And then suddenly in post-COVID years, if you look at these critical raw materials that are needed for digital and green transition, that suddenly has become 30%. And that's a very broad geography. China has those restrictions, Germany has those restrictions, US, and so on. And then for other products, we also see a significant increase, but probably to the region of 10-15%. And that difference between these critical elements and other elements is not what we saw in the data before. So this is more or less the kind of the spirit of transition of nowadays. And countries can try to leverage this growing and large demand for these new resources. It does require high environmental standards and transparency to go with it, to be generally accepted by populations. If you look at the resources in general, quite a bit of these reserves, and reserves is what sits in the ground, can be in the blue block, the block West, and that's very different from current production that is very strongly concentrated in China. And that is in part because mining in general is polluting, and a lot of stuff is concentrated, say, in Canada, but Canadian people are not very keen on developing it in their backyard unless there is no choice. Europe has had very tough year with gas supplies last year, and it's also analysis that we've done. At the same time, the Netherlands are sitting on a gas field that is easy to explore and could supply 1/3 of gas needs for the entire Europe. However, the Dutch people are not keen on exploring that gas field, in part because the Netherlands is the most densely populated economy in Europe, and it's very difficult to put it somewhere far away from people. So these are important considerations, and for that reason there may be no easy solutions, but there are solutions there nonetheless. And an important part of this solution that we show in the report is the work of investment promotion agencies across these developing economies. Pretty much every economy has an investment promotion agency, and we conducted a survey. We sent a questionnaire. We collected answers. The response rate was pretty good, for which we are grateful. And what we see in those responses is that attracting investors in green transition sectors and in investors that are seeking to diversify supply chains out of that concentration that I showed on the earlier charts are increasingly important and targeted by these investment promotion agencies. The priorities differ from economy to economy, but a lot of them are actually exactly that, R&D, software, green economy sectors, and so on. I put here Western Balkan average because we promised to keep individual answers confidential, but this is broadly representative of what countries respond, and probably not surprising in this. There are still more traditional responses targeting agribusiness and food products, and that probably makes great sense for these economies individually. And what we also see in our work, some of which our chief economist started 10 years ago, is that in general, targeting investment promotion works. Economies do receive more investment in sectors that they target. There are various bits and pieces on how that can be done more effectively. We can see it in our economies, and we can also do the before and after analysis. So we wouldn't necessarily compare Montenegro with Germany and Montenegro with Albania. We would compare what happened in Montenegro after a change in targeted sectors and what happened in Germany after a change in targeted sectors, and would see the same. And if we look at the investment profile over the last 10 years using FDI market database, it's probably not surprising that tourism comes overwhelmingly on top in Montenegro. Probably a lot of countries in the region have this profile, but Montenegro is a bit more extreme. This is, though, because we have data on capital investment, but also on jobs, this is an employment-intensive sector. Some other sectors, like renewable energy, are very important for economic development and for powering the economy, but they don't generate all that many jobs, so there are trade-offs in there. In Montenegro also you would see a very even balance between kind of traditional energy and renewable energy.